Let's meet our guests this week. Ajmal Masroor is an imam and broadcaster. Frederick Forsyth, a best-selling author and former spy. John Dalhousen is the Director of Europe and Central Asia for Amnesty International. And Jake Wallace-Simons is Associate Global Editor at Daily Mail Online. Welcome to you all. Morning.
Morning.
Frederick, let's start with you. So we're asking, do our soldiers need perhaps protection from prosecution?
Well, yes. It's a barbed question. If you're asking do they need some kind of carte blanche permission to shoot anybody they want, anytime, any place, including women and children, or prisoners with their hands up, the answer is no, and they're not even asking for it. But what we're talking about here is allegations, some of them extremely vague, some blatantly mendacious, by people who may well be greedy, looking for compensation, about alleged offences 13 years ago. That is absolute nonsense. And what is more nonsense is that the government, with our taxpayers' money, is funding it. And so when the politicians say, oh, we're trying to stop this, they're talking poppycock, because they can stop it any time by cutting off the money supply. These shyster lawyers and bounty hunters wouldn't work for nothing. They're only doing it for money.
John, what kind of message do you think it would send if troops were immune to prosecution?
I think it would clearly and undeniably send fabulously the wrong one. I think any civilised society needs to make it unambiguously clear that certain kinds of behaviour, torturing detainees, executing soldiers in the act of surrender, is utterly unacceptable. Again, I think that fundamental principle isn't wholly in question. What is at issue here is what kind of mechanisms do you need to have in place to ensure that that kind of behaviour, which has happened, is effectively investigated and ultimately prosecuted. What we had before the inquiry that's now so contested is a system that didn't deliver that. What we have now is a system that is delivering that, but with the very serious allegations of abusive process that we've been seeing coming out in the last few months.
Jake, let's get your opinion on this, because Theresa May has said she wants to stop vexatious or end vexatious claims against troops.
Absolutely. Well, it's important to be very clear about this. I mean, nobody is saying that rogue troops who are accused of serious misconduct, murder or rape or anything like that should be allowed to get away with it. Nobody's arguing that. Nobody's saying that we should withdraw from the Geneva Convention or anything like that. There should be accountability there. Military tribunals and investigations should exist. But what we're trying to do is to cut off those avenues that are being abused by lawyers that have been discredited. In fact, there's one big law firm which has been closed down and is itself under investigation under allegations of bribing Iraqis to bear false witness against our troops. We've brought 1,000 cases that are being thrown out, proven to be mendacious and wrong, to stop that sort of thing from happening and close down the avenues that they're using to do that. And the reason is that the men and women that are putting their lives on the line for us, that are going into combat, into very stressful situations, are being hounded and dragged through this years and years of uncertainty and harassment, investigation after investigation. These people have been cleared once already.
And that's clear, and it's clear that that's unacceptable if the process isn't correct. But do you think that troops should be immune from prosecution?
I think that
they should be granted immunity.
We need to look at a way to give them crown immunity from these sorts of prosecutions. That doesn't mean that we will not in some way be under the Geneva Convention or international human rights law, but it does mean that they will have more protection than they have.
So how will that work if we're not?
Well, yeah.
How will that work?
Well, for instance, I mean, the proposal to withdraw from the Human Rights Act and instead replace it with the British Bill of Rights means that we will no longer that our soldiers will no longer be pursued by European law, which was designed for peacetime, not to be applied on the battlefield. Basically, the government needs to look at all the different avenues that it can to stop these mendacious inquiries and give our soldiers the respect and the support that they deserve.
Ajmal, there are 2,000 cases being investigated at the moment. Why do you think there are so many claims against British troops?
Abusing our legal system by the lawyers and the legal firms is wrong, but so is abuse of innocent people or abuse of what we call the Geneva Convention by soldiers is wrong. So two wrongs never make anything right. We need to have a robust legal system, a fair, just system that transcends beyond our emotional plea for protecting our troops. I don't think the troops should have immunity. Nobody should. Legal system, and everyone should be accountable in front of the law. What we have right now is actually a bigger problem. The politicians who decided to invade countries illegally, wage illegal wars, are actually walking around free, scot-free. They're not being accountable. They're not being prosecuted. I would go one step further, that those politicians should be brought to account. They should be tried in The Hague for war crimes, especially a few that I wouldn't want to name yet. But more importantly, the politicians who made the decision and put our soldiers at risk, and also in the eyes and the hands of the potential abuse, the responsibility lies with the politicians. But I stand by Amnesty's stance, and that is nobody should get away with torture, abuse, execution, or any of those crimes that any soldier, even if it's an allegation, they must be investigated thoroughly first.
In our Bristol studio is Lieutenant Colonel Nicholas Mercer, who was the Army's top legal officer in Iraq in 2003. This morning we've heard from former Prime Minister Tony Blair, who's condemned the prosecutions or the vexatious claims made against soldiers. Can we get your view, Lieutenant Colonel?
Yes, good morning. Well, first of all, Tony Blair's view, I think one just has to take that with a degree of caution, given that, of course, he doesn't want anyone pursuing anyone for potential war crimes. I'd just park that to one side. There a frenzy is being whipped up at the moment by the government about spurious claims. Who says the claims are spurious? So far, the government have settled 326 cases at a cost of £20 million. Now, by anyone's standards, that's an awful lot of abuse, and £20 million is an awful lot of money. The government have only won one case, and that was Al Swedi, which was shown to be spurious. But I think you have to be very careful about saying these are all spurious cases.
So are all the right people being pursued?
Well, can I just make one point about interrogation techniques? I've read a lot of the allegations with regard to interrogation, and there's a great deal of consistency on the witness evidence. And what appears might have happened is that the government have allowed interrogators to use illegal techniques in interrogation. Let me just clarify that. That's physical, sexual and religious abuse. The government know full well who was interrogated. They've got video recordings of those interrogations. And to say on the one hand they're all spurious when they could actually cross-reference these claims, I think that needs to be clarified. Can I also say that these allegations are not just made by law firms. Some were made by me, because I was a senior officer during the Iraq War. Some were made by other senior officers, because I served with them and they complained independently. Some were made by the International Committee of the Red Cross, and a trooper in the SAS, Trooper Ben Griffin, is under a High Court injunction because he wants to speak out against prisoner abuse, but the Ministry of Defence have injuncted him. So it's a very different picture from the one that's being cleverly crafted in the media at the moment.
Well, as a top legal officer in Iraq, can tell us, is the army not capable of policing itself?
Well, of course, if the Ministry of Defence sign off unlawful tactics and they're complicit in rendition, which is another of the allegations, then of course it's never going to investigate itself. And you've got to treat all this with a degree of caution, because if the Ministry of Defence are implicated in some of these offences, then of course it wants to see them finished off. And in the case of Ben Griffin, who refused to soldier, they refused to court-martial him because his defence would have been, look how they mistreated the prisoners, and they didn't want to go near that.
It's also very important to note that our government did sell the torture chambers and torture contracts to illegitimate and despotic regimes around the world. And our government was in cahoots with many of the rendition thing that has been just mentioned. But more importantly, what's most striking for me is ask the Iraqis and the Afghanis, ask their experiences on the ground, the Bagram Air Base, Guantanamo Bay experience, and the worst Abu Ghraib. Those images of prisoners being tortured will never go away from our minds. So these need to be investigated thoroughly, and once and for all, either our soldiers are exonerated or they're prosecuted. It's simple.
Frederick.
Yeah, you forget to mention two things. One is that the three cases you've just evoked were all Americans. They had nothing to do with the British at all. We weren't at Abu Ghraib. But the other thing I think that nobody ever mentions is the ROE, the rules of engagement. For an ordinary soldier with a rifle and someone sniping at him from over that sand dune, the ROE is much more important than the Geneva Convention. He hasn't memorised the Geneva Convention. He will have memorised the ROE. And British ROEs are far, far more stringent than any other known fighting force in the Western world.
Disciplined.
Yep. And very harshly enforced.
And should be.
But
yes,
should there be?
I'm saying they are.
Frederick's point, perhaps, is that the rules, how you'd behave on the high street here, and the rules of engagement, what you do on the battlefield, have to be different.
I think they have to be very clear. They will be different. They are different. There's nothing in human rights law that prevents them being different or necessarily restrictive for the kinds of things that need to be done. I think there's a massive convergence between international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, human rights law, and sound common sense, which says there are certain things that you just cannot do to people you have in your custody. I think what we've had here is a series of instructions and rules that have not been clear, and where they have been quite clear, they have nonetheless been highly problematic. They have authorized techniques that people have done, believing that they were fulfilling a legitimate order, which was not. So what is the appropriate response in this situation? Is it to somehow sweep this entire issue under the carpet, which seems to be also the desire of those, the higher up you go in the chain, the more that this is being advocated, as if this is somehow to the greater credit and benefit of the armed forces? Or is it to acknowledge this straight on, find a mechanism that can investigate these abuses properly, and try and identify some of the systemic problems that are there? This is why we had this inquiry in the first place.
I mean, no one's disagreeing that there are some very serious cases that warrant allegation, but what we need to acknowledge is that there are a great many, huge number, hundreds, even up to the thousands, of spurious and vexatious allegations being brought against our troops for two reasons. One, to take advantage of public funds. We've seen tens of millions of pounds being hosed in to unscrupulous lawyers' pockets. And two, to discredit the armed forces. So take the Al-Swedi investigation, for instance. It was thrown out, showing that it was founded on deliberate and calculated lies. That took hundreds of pieces of evidence from Iraqis saying that the British Army has somehow gunned down a whole load of farmers, while withholding evidence that they weren't farmers, they were militants who would ambush the British
Is your solution to this to
Dismantle
the system?
So what I'm saying is that our soldiers deserve better than this. I'm not saying that they should be allowed to get away with murder or get away with breaking the Geneva Convention or the rules of combat. What I am saying is that we need to stop mendacious law firms bringing the sorts of cases that they have been bringing, dragging our soldiers through the mud, and ruining their lives in many cases.
So you agree?
Without them having the proper defence and the gratitude that we should be giving them.
So you agree that the soldiers should not be immune from prosecution. What you're looking for and asking for is more stringent rules and regulations governing our legal firms. It's a very different discussion.
No.
That's what you're saying. But let me ask you the second question.
We need to close down.
Let him answer the first one.
We need to close down the avenues that they are using and exploiting to bring false claims against the armed forces, A, to line their pockets, and B, to do down the British Army.
There's no difference.
So you agree that we agree that the soldiers are not immune from prosecution as long as the legal system is watertight and there is no room for abuse. That's number one. But the bigger issue is, look, if somebody is making an allegation, Britain and its legal standard is an amazing one in the world. It is respected by everybody. Now, if our soldiers,
these people are turning it into a laughing stock. If
our soldiers or anybody within our legal system, within our political system, is accused of a crime, such heinous crime, surely the best thing we should do is investigate it.
That's right. But the problem is that when the accusations that are brought against our soldiers are clearly mendacious. I mean, for instance...
Let the court decide.
Exactly. For example, there have been accusations that prisoners were left having to ask for water without being offered water to begin with. That was one of the accusations that is being investigated. There's been a Taliban bomb maker who was sentenced to 10 years for making bombs to blow up coalition forces, and the British Army were accused of detaining him for a few weeks too long.
OK, I want to hear...
Our legal system can do that.
Please, I find it very interesting what you're all saying, but I also find it very interesting what our audience is saying as well. And thank you. You've been sending your texts and tweets on this. We can hear some of your reactions. Tommy, you've been going through them.
Yes, Naga. Lots of people at home naturally very sympathetic towards the extreme situations that British troops have to go through, but they're also saying no one's above the law. So Paul says, war is hell. It's an outrage to prosecute soldiers for doing the job that government sent them to do. We've also got a message here from Tess, who says, I think it's something that needs to be addressed on a case-by-case basis, but there should be a line which is never crossed. Elizabeth also getting in touch saying, if there's serious misconduct, prosecution is not legal abuse. Nobody is above the law. Mark on Twitter saying, yes, if you've ever been to these places, and I have, you'd be aware of the stress that service personnel are under and the courage that they display. And another Mark on the text getting in touch this morning and saying, I served in the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment in both Iraq and Afghanistan. If you want me to be prosecuted for following orders, go after the officers that gave us the orders.
OK, Tommy, thanks very much. Let's talk to Lieutenant Colonel Nicholas Mercer. I hope you were hearing that some of the comments there, courage and stress, the environment that soldiers are in. Your reaction to what our viewers are saying?
Well, I mean, I hear what they say about stress and everything else on the battlefield, and no one disagrees with that. We took a very cautious view. Soldiers in the heat of battle, we wouldn't go near it in terms of prosecuting. A lift operation, and it's pretty rough and unpleasant, we wouldn't do it. But once a man was reduced to capture, they should be treated decently, and the army train its soldiers to treat all prisoners with dignity and humanity. The vast majority of these cases are about abuse of either civilians or prisoners. And we got it very badly wrong, and it's absolutely right that that's brought before a court. There are 2 cases before the courts at the moment, because everyone mentions Al-Swedi, which was spurious. But there was Karim Ali last week. Sir George Newman was very scathing of the way they behaved.
I want to stay away from individual cases, Frederick.
But I mean, you know, this case is always bandied around Al-Swedi. That's the one case that has been shown to be spurious. Everything else has been found to be well-founded, and people lose sight of that.
Frederick, moving forward, when we have discussions like this, when the Prime Minister says she wants to avoid vexatious claims, thinking of people who are thinking of joining the army, or the reputation of the British Army, how is this going to affect that?
Well, it demoralises, of course. It's intended to demoralise. It's not accidental. And I think what the Colonel hasn't mentioned is that we haven't actually fought anybody in a national uniform since the Falklands. The people we fought in the Middle East weren't in uniform. They can all claim to be civilians. Every sniper, every bomb planter.
They were soldiers. They were our soldiers.
We didn't fight them. We didn't fight them in Iraq. We invaded their country.
But no, just the point. No, I don't want to get onto that discussion.
Well,
but Frederick,
put Tony Blair on trial.
Exactly.
Put Corporal Smith on trial.
I agree. Put Tony Blair on trial. Definitely.
I don't want this to go off.
They're going for the corporal.
Frederick,
as usual.
Our soldiers were fighting.
A scapegoat.
Our soldiers were, though, fighting in British uniform.
Yes, I didn't say that. I said we haven't fought anybody else against anybody in a national uniform since the Falklands, because they weren't wearing uniforms. They were pretending to be civilians.
What difference does that make?
Well, how are you to know which is which until he fires at you?
So you abuse their rights.
No.
You hold them, you detain them, you torture them, you execute them without any process. Is that what you're saying?
No, I didn't say that. I said that when they're actually in combat, the people they're in combat against can 10 minutes later say, I'm a civilian.
Fair enough.
When he's thrown his Kalashnikov away.
You arrest them, right? You put them through a process, but you don't execute them, you don't torture them, you don't violate their rights. And if you have done it, face prosecution or face the court.
Okay.
What's the problem?
Because
you know what?
The soldier on the other side, the ISIL soldier, can say, I wasn't a soldier.
And so
therefore,
what?
I want £50,000, if you'd be so kind, because I was knocked on the head by a British soldier.
I have full faith in our legal system, and I believe our judges, our courts, can decide on what claim is crazy and fantasy and what is real.
Ajmal, thank you very much. Gentlemen, thank you very much.